remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
In 1945, Japan watched 2 cities and countless lives tragically and violently destroyed through what was, at the time, an inconceivable man-made weapon that changed the world after it. And then the dust settled. What followed was a country that was forever changed not only physically, but also emotionally by what had become the nuclear age. This new age meant that what had been pre-established in Japan's cultural media status quo could no longer stay the same, because when everything else changes, art has no choice but to follow.
もしも兵器として使用されたならば、それこそ水爆と同じように人類を破滅に導くかもしれません。
At first, there were monsters walking, roaring embodiments of nuclear dread. Godzilla was perhaps the first very famous allegory for nuclear war and the atomic bomb that resonated with the public and set a precedent for what was to follow. Eventually, those monsters became something else, machines built not only to destroy humanity, but to contain it. The mecha genre was born in a country haunted by the notion and experience of invention as a means to bring destruction. And yet, innovation was the only way to move forward. The result were stories that asked, what happens when one person holds the power to destroy the world, and they also happen to be a teenage boy? This isn't just about cool robots, it's about grief, it's about control, it's about the dream of mastering destruction, it's about Japan dealing with this collective catastrophe that they went through in a creative way in this specific genre of manga and anime. I've always been very familiar with mecha anime. Not that it was ever my favorite genre, but if you're ever in the anime space, you are aware of mecha anime, and it was always around when I was growing up. And recently I was rewatching Attack on Titan and came to the realization that it was mecha anime. Not that that's news to anyone, but it was a realization for me. So I ended up falling down this research rabbit hole about the origins of mecha anime and everything about it. And I felt like I had to make this video. Okay, first let's get one thing straight. Mecha doesn't just mean big robot. It's short for mechanical, yes, but in anime it has come to mean an entire genre built around machines as extensions of the human will. Think of it as the meeting point between science fiction, war stories, and often a coming-of-age power fantasy. There are essentially 2 main flavors of mecha. The first is the super robot, the mythic, toyetic, punch evil in the face kind of mecha. Think these guys. It's less depressed and more about heroism, control, that coming-of-age power fantasy that I talked about. And then you've got what I call the real robot, grittier, more political, grounded in war, not fantasy. Think these guys. They basically asked, what if the robot was a weapon in an endless conflict? It's relevant to mention that the genre's defining feature isn't the machine itself, it's the interface essentially. It's the moment when a human connects to a weapon and becomes something more or less than human. That's why I'd argue that Attack on Titan is, spiritually, a mecha anime. Sure, there's no lasers or control panel, but the themes are the same. A human merges with an enormous anthropomorphic weapon, becomes both savior and monster, and the line between pilot and machine gets blurred. So yeah, it's mecha, but it's fleshy mecha, which is maybe worse, but to really understand how mecha became one of Japan's most mournful and most impactful genres, we really have to go back to where it started. Post-World War II Japan, under the occupying forces, heavily censored direct depictions of the war, and especially the atomic bombings, so artists turned elsewhere to allegory, to fantasy, and eventually to machines. Godzilla in 1954 wasn't just a monster movie, it was a nation projecting its fear of nuclear annihilation onto a creature it could confront on screen, and just 2 years later, Tetsujin, I'm so sorry about the pronunciation, Tetsujin 28 literally put that fear into a machine, a robot born of war, now piloted by a child for peace. Science could destroy, but it also could protect, and mecha became the canvas through which they could convey this moral ambivalence. In other words, technology became a mirror, a reflection of humanity's best and worst impulses. The atomic bomb showed what humans could do at the height of their scientific achievement, but the result and the intent of it was mass death and destruction. Early mecha stories took that lesson seriously, because if the fate of the world is in a robot's hands, someone has to push the buttons. So in the new nuclear age, mecha was born, a genre where human guilt, ingenuity, and hope could coexist in a single frame. But machines alone didn't make this genre resonate. For that, you needed society trying to rebuild itself, a new generation learning to live in a different world. So you have these coming-of-age stories where you are learning to coexist and control these weapons of mass destruction. Godzilla was never a mecha anime, of course, but it is the starting point and the beginning of this trope of the monster as a weapon that mecha then adopted and developed to the point where the lines between the monster and the human started to blur progressively over time. By the 1960s, despite still rebuilding, Japan had shifted from its immediate post-war recovery period to a period of modernization. The economy was booming, technology was advancing at a breakneck pace, and a new generation of Japanese children grew up surrounded by the promise of progress. And in the middle of all of this were giant robots, not as relics of war, but as emblems of possibility. Mazinger Z, debuting in 1972, was the first anime to put the human pilot inside of the robot, which is the norm now, but at the time, it was radical. For the first time, humans weren't just controlling machines remotely, they were inside them, guiding their power directly, and that active connection became a much more personal way of taking control of these machines. In many ways, the mecha became a shonen rite of passage. Boys like Koji were not just heroes, they were avatars for a society learning to master modernity. Piloting a giant robot was, in a sense, learning to pilot the future itself. And yet, it's relevant to mention that underneath all these heroism, there were subtle messages about gender and power. Male pilots were the focal point of these stories, asserting control over technology and symbolically over the world. Female characters often appeared as mechanized forms of femininity or as support figures, the narrative quietly reinforcing patriarchal hierarchies, even as the robots themselves suggested limitless potential. This gets progressively better over the decades. In short, during this period of recovery, mecha provided reassurance that this destructive technology and this immense power could still be made human and controlled by humans. But as robots grew more sophisticated, the stories began to be more complex and ask harder questions about war, about responsibility, about the cost of wielding power. So now we have the real robot revolution, finally featuring Mobile Suit Gundam. By the late 70s, mecha had evolved. Gone were the mythic robots that smashed monsters and saved cities. Mobile Suit Gundam reframed the genre. The machines were no longer saviors, they were tools of war, and the people were both its victims and its wielders. Gundam didn't glamorize battle, it showed bureaucracy, trauma, and politics. Battles weren't heroic set pieces, they were messy, costly, and morally ambiguous. The enemy wasn't a monster, it was another human being with their own motivations. And the technology that promised control became a source of anxiety and guilt. Amuro Ray, the young pilot at the center of the story, embodies the post-war generation. He inherits a world built by the mistakes of the adults that came before him, carrying a weight that he never asked for. The responsibility of wielding extraordinary power under impossible circumstances crushes him. If Mazinger Z was a boy controlling power, Gundam was a boy crushed beneath it. Gundam's real robot revolution transformed mecha from escapist fantasy into a platform for exploring responsibility, politics, and the moral cost of power. And while the genre grew more serious, it also set the stage for even darker, more introspective evolutions, such as in Neon Genesis Evangelion and later Attack on Titan, where the lines between the monster and the human became completely blurred. By the mid-1990s, mecha had begun to turn inward. Neon Genesis Evangelion didn't just depict giant robots battling monsters, it depicted the apocalypse as something personal. The end of the world was no longer out there in the sky, it was inside the pilot's mind. AVIT units became metaphors for mental illness, isolation, and the crushing weight of generational disillusionment. Pilots like Shinji weren't heroes, they were mirrors of a society grappling with its own anxieties. The Avas aren't purely robots, they're bioorganic and have human-like structures. They have a lifespan and they feel pain. The Avas are imbued with the soul of the pilot's mother, and that's how the pilots synchronize with them. There's no longer a clear separation between the human and the weapon. Avas are permanently psychologically linked to only one pilot. Fast forward to Attack on Titan, and traditional mecha has completely gone out the window, to the point where most people don't even begin to consider it one. There are no control panels, there are no metal vessels, and yet thematically the parallels are uncanny. In this, humans obtain this power by consuming those who wield it, becoming weapons in flesh and bone. Titans are biomechanical monsters, embodiments of historical trauma, guilt, and the endless cycles of violence that shape nations. The themes are never clearer than they are here. Isolationism, militarization, moral relativism, themes that were explored half a century ago are now being explored through flesh instead of steel. When Eren or anyone else transforms, it's not a power fantasy, it's a genetic sin. The machine isn't metal anymore, it's flesh and blood, and it's almost the same as us. The mecha is human. It's also not lost on me the irony of Attack on Titan's plot and themes being inspired by World War II. It's kind of a full circle moment. Attack on Titan is a mecha anime. Mecha anime came to be after World War II. World War II inspired Attack on Titan. Also, in Attack on Titan, the Colossal Titan is used as a huge bomb, so you can't really get more heavy-handed than that. Anyway, as mecha grew darker, more introspective, and more grotesquely human, the genre that once celebrated control and progress began to dissipate. I can't really think of any popular current mecha anime, if there are any at all. Maybe Attack on Titan served as the final nail in the coffin of this long-running genre. Maybe we as a society have evolved past this particular trope and storytelling tool. Or maybe it will come back. For the ending of the video, I was trying to figure out like a genre of anime that would have replaced mecha in the current cultural zeitgeist. I couldn't really pick one though. I think modern isekai and modern shonen have captured our cultural moment pretty well. Our anxieties around identity, around purpose, around like finding meaning in life and surviving the world in general. I think they're doing that pretty well. Even though I do still think that mecha is really relevant and these stories are kind of timeless. Look, Attack on Titan finished really recently as well, so it's not like it's been no mecha for years, but the real traditional robot mecha has really become less prevalent. But I do think that these themes are equally as relevant as they were then, if anything, and they might come back, maybe in the same shape or maybe in a different shape. Who knows? But the stories are still worth revisiting. Also, Evangelion is the best intro to any anime ever.